My wife asked me if she could have a free pass to our wedding during the company party, and the answer came out of my mouth before my heart could process the depth of the wound. Yes, you can, and it comes with a signed divorce. I spread the papers before her, right there, surrounded by colleagues, half-full glasses, and smiles that faded into thin air. An awkward silence fell over the room while the music continued playing as if nothing had happened, as if my soul wasn't being ripped from my chest in invisible pieces. I left there alone, but not defeated. I left with the pain burning inside, but with my head held high, like someone who bleeds but doesn't bow. Because love isn't a prison, but it's also not a joke. It's not a territory with open borders where anyone can enter and do whatever they want. Love is choice, it's surrender, it's emotional exclusivity. And what she asked for that night was the right to betray me with my permission, to play with the limits of our story in the name of a freedom she never had the courage to ask for when she was still sincere. She wanted the security of home and the warmth of adventure, she wanted stability and excitement, she wanted two worlds in one body, and the price for that would be my dignity. But right there that night, I decided I wouldn't pay. It all started weeks earlier, when I realized she was different. It wasn't just the delays, nor the smiles hidden in her phone. It was an absent look, a soulless presence, as if her body were with me, but her mind drifting somewhere I had no free pass. And it wasn't long before the clues piled up like shards of a shattered mirror, deleted messages, improvised apologies, perfumes too new for an old relationship. What destroyed me wasn't just the suspicion, but her attempt to convince me it was all in my head, that I was insecure, jealous, paranoid. It made me doubt myself, my instincts, my lucidity. She would smile and say, "You're seeing ghosts," when the ghosts had already crawled into our bed. And when she finally had the audacity to ask for that absurdity, the temporary freedom to be unfaithful with my consent, it was as if she were tearing apart everything we'd once built together. As if she were looking me in the eye and saying, "You're not enough, and I need something more." But there were no tears. No screams. Just my steady hand on the papers, and her frozen expression faced with the choice she never thought she'd truly face. After I left, I spent days without proper sleep. The nights were long and humid with sweat and memories. I wondered when she stopped loving me. When I stopped being the man who made her eyes shine. And at the same time, I struggled with anger, with the indignation of having been made a fool, of having nurtured a love that, behind the scenes, was already being shared in small doses with someone else. It wasn't an abrupt end, it was a slow process of emotional erosion. And the truth is, deep down, she didn't want to leave me, she just wanted more. She wanted to be able to explore, to experiment, but without losing the security of my embrace at night. She wanted someone who would desire her with the intensity of the forbidden, yet still be certain of my love at the end of the day. And that's where she lost herself. Not by cheating, but by disregarding the value of what she already had in the name of fleeting excitement. Because what she thought would be empowerment was, in fact, selfishness. And when she saw the divorce signed, the freedom she so longed for turned into loneliness. I saw her try to resist at first. She posted smiling photos, went out with friends, showed the world a strong version of herself. But I knew it was a facade. Because I knew that smile. I knew the genuine sparkle in her eyes, and that sparkle was gone. She tried to convince herself that everything was okay, that this was the right path, that she could finally live without feeling tied down. But freedom without love becomes disorientation. And that's how she started reaching out to me again. First with neutral messages, then with questions disguised as concern, and finally with statements that mixed guilt and longing. She said she missed me, that she no longer slept well, that life felt meaningless without me. But the answer was already given. I had closed that chapter. And as much as her words still touched me, I knew that going back would be a betrayal of myself. She begged to talk in person. She said she needed to see me, that she had something to say, that she couldn't stand the silence anymore. And even though I knew it wouldn't change anything, I accepted. We met in a neutral place, with no memories of us. When she arrived, time seemed to have passed differently for her. Her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who understood too late the value of what she'd lost. She sat across from me and began speaking unfiltered. She told me everything, about how her lover disappeared a few days after the party, how she tried to contact him, but he'd ignored her. How the nights alone grew longer, how people's gazes began to weigh heavy, how every corner of the house screamed my absence. She said she realized love wasn't that instant thrill, but the constancy of those who stay even when life tires. That she felt ashamed of herself. That she betrayed me even before the touch, by wanting another life within a commitment she swore to honor. And after it all, she said she loved me. That she always had. That she just hadn't known how to care. I remained silent. I listened to everything without interrupting. Not out of coldness, but because that was the last time I would allow her to occupy space in my heart. And when she finished, with teary eyes and a trembling voice, I simply said I forgave her. Not for her, but for myself. Because holding a grudge would be carrying a weight that no longer belonged to me. And at that moment, she broke down. She burst into convulsive sobs, as if she had finally understood the magnitude of the loss. But the cruelest thing about forgiveness is that it doesn't bring reconciliation. It only liberates. And that's what I did, I freed myself. And I moved on. Over time, I found love again. A calm, mature love, made of sincere conversations and comfortable silences. Someone who didn't need to test me to know what I felt. Who looked into my eyes with truth and held my hand firmly. A love that didn't ask for a free pass, but offered reciprocity. And that's when I understood, sometimes, true love only arrives when you have the courage to let go of the love that didn't respect you. Sometimes, it's at the bottom of the emotional pit that we find the ladder. And when she learned I was with someone else, she tried once more to get closer. She tried to smile like before, remember the good times, promise to change. But I had already changed. I was no longer that man willing to beg for attention. And in that last conversation, when she asked me if there was still a chance, I replied as calmly as I'd signed the divorce papers, no. But I hope you find peace. And she lowered her eyes, as if knowing she'd lost not only a husband, but the only man who had ever truly loved her. And in that moment, I saw clearly, her regret wasn't just for having betrayed me, but for having chosen the ephemeral and lost the eternal. But what she never knew, and what no one ever discovered, is that at that very party, at the very moment she asked for a free pass, her lover had already regretted everything. He'd already sent her a message she didn't see. And when she was alone, he didn't want to stay either. She wasn't rejected by me. She was rejected by everyone. But the cruelest part of all was yet to come. Because the day she found the courage to truly try to win me back, she heard a phrase that completely changed what she thought she knew about the end of our love. And it was that phrase, that changed everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal, ever. All the stories are fictional, but they carry profound truths. Betrayal destroys, corrodes, and takes away what is most valuable, trust. Each narrative is a warning, a mirror of what many live in silence. Prepare yourself, what you're about to hear is intense, painful, and unforgettable. Take a deep breath. The story begins. In the cozy silence of a late autumn afternoon, with the golden leaves dancing in the wind, there was something about this couple that drew attention without needing to be overstated. They weren't perfect, but together they seemed to form something bordering on balance. Michael and Emily met when they were young, their senior year of college, on one of those unpretentious dates that only seem to mean something after time passes. She was vibrant, determined, with a lightness in her eyes that was infectious. He was more introspective, analytical, soft-spoken, but with a firm presence, the kind that inspires security. They were different, but perhaps it was precisely this difference that, in the beginning, made them look at each other with genuine curiosity, with that rare feeling that there was something there worth discovering. The relationship began intensely, but also with a mature calm, the kind that doesn't need to be rushed to feel genuine. The relationship lasted 2 years, enough time for both to understand that they didn't just want to share moments, they wanted to build a life. And so, on a simple weekend, in an unostentatious ceremony, surrounded only by their closest friends, they promised each other what all couples promise: love, fidelity, partnership. And, for a long time, they kept these promises effortlessly. They shared dreams, debts, renovations, dogs, lazy Sundays, and everyday secrets that only those who live together understand the importance of. There was complicity in the dinner conversations, in the silly jokes on ordinary days, and even in the small disagreements that arose from time to time, and which always ended up being resolved with a sincere apology or a tight hug amidst the silence. Emily built a solid career in marketing for a large company. She was ambitious, but she balanced her desire for growth with the affection she showed at home. Michael, on the other hand, worked as a systems engineer and preferred the stability of fixed schedules, the comfort of coming home early, the pleasure of cooking together or watching a forgotten series while sharing a blanket. He never made grand declarations, but he showed love in the details, washing the dishes even when tired, leaving notes around the house, remembering dates even she couldn't remember. She, on the other hand, had a more outgoing nature, enjoying being with friends, laughing out loud, and escaping the routine. He, introverted by nature, learned to keep up with her without losing his essence. It was a dance. Not always perfect, but honest. The apartment where they lived reflected their fusion, modern paintings chosen by Emily and shelves meticulously organized by Michael. It smelled of fresh coffee in the morning and cheap wine on Friday nights. To outsiders, it was the portrait of a functional couple. But the truth is that behind every relationship lies a delicate engineering of expectations, silences, concessions, and choices that no one sees. And even without major conflicts, there were times when both seemed to grow apart, not for lack of love, but perhaps because of the inevitable weight of routine. There's no manual for keeping alive what was once intense, and time, when mismanaged, can cool even the most sincere affections. Emily began taking on more responsibilities at work. Travel became more frequent, phone calls shorter, and conversations often consisted of text messages exchanged between meetings. Michael understood, or at least tried. He never complained openly. He knew she was growing, fulfilling the dreams she'd always had. But absence, even if justified, digs holes that, if left unfilled, become ditches. And he, who had always been more reserved, began to keep his discomfort to himself, afraid of appearing controlling or insecure. He believed that love also meant allowing the other person to soar, even if it meant watching them drift away. Emily, meanwhile, was immersed in a new world, surrounded by people with similar ambitions, modern ideas about relationships, and emotional freedom. Little by little, she began to question some things that had previously seemed unquestionable. What was fidelity? Where is the line between desire and betrayal? Why did love have to be exclusive? It wasn't dissatisfaction with her husband, exactly, but an inner restlessness difficult to explain. There was nothing wrong at home, but perhaps there was something missing within her. And these questions, though silent, began to shape her decisions, even if she didn't yet clearly realize it. The circle of friends had also changed. Dinners with longtime couples gave way to more dynamic get-togethers with co-workers, filled with discussions about innovation, careers, and self-discovery. Michael even tried to join in occasionally, but it was clear he didn't feel comfortable in that environment. Emily, on the other hand, shone. And he, admiring from afar, tried not to feel diminished by this new universe she seemed to embrace so easily. Still, there were never any serious arguments, no heavy fights. It was all very subtle, the small delays, the quicker hugs, the "I love you," said almost out of habit. The signs were there, but sometimes love is blinded by choice. Or by fear. They continued to sleep in the same bed, share the same vacation plans, talk about kitchen renovations and the new car. But something, invisible, had already changed. Michael was beginning to feel out of place in his own marriage. Not because he was being mistreated, but because he no longer felt included in her dreams. It was as if, little by little, she was building a future in which he was only a supporting character. And it hurt. But he never spoke. He remained present, attentive, trying to rekindle a flame that, although still alive, was already flickering in the wind of doubt. There were, however, moments when everything seemed the same. A secluded weekend in the cabin they used to rent in the mountains, a spontaneous dinner, a lingering kiss for no reason. In those moments, Michael believed everything was still right. That it was just a phase. That their love hadn't been lost, just muffled by adulthood. Emily, in those moments, also seemed to return. She laughed more lightly, looked at him tenderly, reached for his hand with the familiarity of someone who knows where home is. But something inside her still pulsed differently, as if there was a part of her he could no longer reach. And that emptiness, however small, grew silently. The invitation to the company party came as another opportunity for reconnection. Emily was excited, talking about the event as a chance to show her husband her surroundings, to blend their two worlds. Michael, as always, said yes, even though he preferred the peace and quiet of the couch. He thought maybe it would be a good thing, that seeing her colleagues, learning a little more about her daily life, could bring them closer together again. And in the days leading up to the event, everything seemed to be going well. They bought new clothes, made plans for after the party, and talked about future trips. The atmosphere was strangely light, as if the two had made a silent pact to try. But there was a subtle unease in Emily's gaze. A barely concealed hesitation, like someone carrying a question that had been bottled up for days. Michael noticed, but didn't press. He thought it was just the nerves of the event. He hadn't imagined that night, something would change forever. The stage was set, the lights, the smiles, the toasts. But there was silence between them, even amidst the noise. And then she asked the question. A simple, direct question, but with the power to implode everything they had built. And he answered. Without shouting. Without drama. Only with the certainty of someone who has finally understood that love can die even without hate, and that sometimes, the greatest sign of self-respect is knowing when to let go. And it was in that moment, amid raised glasses and curious glances, that their story changed forever. Not for lack of love. But because sometimes love doesn't survive when only one side is committed to keeping it alive. And what came next, no one expected. Not her. Not him. Not fate itself. Michael began to feel something slipping through his fingers like unstoppable fine sand. There was no clear cause, nor an abrupt change, but small signs, like invisible splinters embedded beneath the skin. Emily was more distracted, distant in subtle, painful ways. The way she kissed him before leaving, the delay in responding to simple messages, the change in her tone of voice when they discussed future plans. Everything seemed the same, but nothing was. Michael tried to convince himself it was just a phase, perhaps fatigue, the accumulation of responsibilities, or simply the routine taking its toll. But deep down, something deeper had already taken hold, the intuition of someone who loves and feels when they are being silently forgotten. The days passed, and the company party approached. Emily was excited, more animated than usual, talking about the event with an almost adolescent enthusiasm, like someone waiting for something far beyond a professional get-together. Michael noticed, but said nothing. She deserved to have fun, he thought, after months of intense work and sleepless nights. When she invited him to go with her, he hesitated. He didn't like that kind of atmosphere, but he accepted. He wanted to be present, to show that he was still a part of her life, even when he felt he was already being pushed to the periphery of her priorities. It was an attempt. A last attempt. On the night of the party, Emily looked stunning. Her red dress highlighted her elegance and confidence. Michael watched her silently as she finished putting on her makeup, a smile on his face that seemed to no longer belong to him. In the car, the ride was silent, interrupted only by general comments about traffic and music. When they arrived, she introduced him to her colleagues casually, but not affectionately. It was as if he were there merely to fulfill a formality. For the first few hours, Michael remained by her side, but gradually he moved away, giving her space, as she so often claimed she needed. He sat on one of the sofas in the corner of the room, a glass in his hand, watching her from afar. She moved between the tables with ease, laughing easily, drinking, touching shoulders, leaning in for conversations that seemed too intimate for the surroundings. And then came the request. When she approached and asked if he'd mind giving her a free pass that night, justifying that everyone there was open-minded, and that it didn't mean there was a lack of love, Michael wasn't sure at first if he'd heard her correctly. The phrase, as absurd as it was painful, pierced his chest like a cold blade. He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, searching her eyes for some shadow of the woman he'd married. But she held his gaze, confident, as if she'd rehearsed this scene many times before. And in that instant, he knew. It wasn't a question. It was a confession. The free pass she requested wasn't a wish, it was the normalization of something that was already happening. This wasn't the beginning of the fall, it was the point at which the fall was already inevitable. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just took a deep breath, pulled out the divorce papers he'd prepared days earlier, and handed them to her without a trace of hesitation. Emily froze. The color drained from her face. Her hands trembled. She hadn't expected this. She thought he'd give in, that he'd pretend not to see, that he'd prefer to keep the marriage intact out of convenience, as so many would. But Michael chose self-respect. And at that moment, amid surprised looks and disconcerted murmurs, he stood and left. The room remained lit, the music played, but for him, everything had gone dark inside. The pain was dry, suffocating, as if the air had been knocked out of the room. In the days that followed, Michael entered a kind of emotional exile. He continued going to work, maintaining his routine, but inside, everything was devastated. He replayed every scene, every touch, every change in behavior. Everything now made sense. The absences, the smiles that no longer belonged to him, the hasty apologies. Emily tried to contact him, calling him repeatedly, sending messages. None of them aggressive, just filled with guilt and confusion. She said she didn't know what she was doing, that she'd lost herself in the pressure, that she wanted to talk. But he didn't respond. Because he knew there was no more conversation that could erase what had been said. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was the discarding of a story so carefully constructed. She showed up at his door 4 days later. She was haggard, without makeup, wearing a loose blouse, and her hair tied up messily. Michael stared at her for a few seconds before opening the door. They sat in the living room in silence. She began to speak. She told him she hadn't meant to hurt him, that she was just confused, that she'd felt suffocated lately, that the free pass proposal had been made without thinking. But her voice sounded desperate, yet distant. There was something she was still hiding. Michael listened to it all, his expression firm, without responding. Until she confessed. She said she had indeed gotten involved with someone. That it wasn't planned. That it happened slowly. That it started with harmless conversations, with confidences about life, with admiration. And then, without realizing it, she had crossed a line. She said she felt alive, desired, that for a moment she had forgotten everything. But then she realized her mistake. That the other man hadn't wanted anything serious. That it was just an impulse, and that she had already ended it. Michael said nothing. He just looked at her as if seeing, for the first time, the true face of someone he had loved for years. The silence between them was more painful than any scream. Emily cried, held his hand, begged for forgiveness. She said she wanted to rebuild. She would do anything. That she accepted the pain, but couldn't bear to lose him. Michael, inside, struggled with everything he felt. Part of him wanted to hold her, erase it all, pretend it was just a nightmare. But the other part, the wounded, betrayed, abandoned part, screamed for dignity. For sanity. He knew that if he gave in, he would never be able to trust again. That they would live under the weight of that brokenness. That everything they had built was tainted by a silent poison. She left that night, more devastated than when she arrived. Michael sat there, staring at the ring on the table. It was strange how something so small could weigh so much. In the following days, mutual friends began to drift apart, some trying to understand what had happened, others simply avoiding taking sides. He didn't care. He didn't need anyone to choose sides. He just needed to breathe. To sleep without waking up in the middle of the night with a heavy heart. To walk the streets without feeling like he'd been torn apart inside. Emily tried a few more times. She wrote a letter. She sent flowers. She said she wanted to start over. But he didn't respond. Because, even when you love, sometimes you have to let go. Even when you want to believe, sometimes you have to accept that the other person made choices that can't be undone. And even when everything inside you screams that there's still love, dignity needs to speak louder. Then she disappeared for a time. She disappeared from social media, from the places they used to frequent. Michael, little by little, began to rebuild himself. There was no rush. He sought no revenge, no compensation. He simply wanted to be whole again. And it was in this process, of silence and solitude, that he began to see himself more clearly. To recognize his own strength, his own ability to begin again. The love he had for her didn't disappear overnight, but gradually dissolved, like ice in the sun. And what remained was a melancholy but true peace. But what Michael didn't yet know, was that the betrayal hadn't been the worst part. That there was something hidden, buried beneath Emily's regret. Something she carried heavily but never had the courage to speak. A secret that would not only put the infidelity in perspective, but would completely change everything he thought about the end of their marriage. A detail that, when it finally came to light, would allow no return, no easy forgiveness, no tears to justify it. And that moment was getting closer and closer. When she reappeared at the apartment door, there was no eye makeup or familiar perfume. Her loose hair fell shapelessly over her shoulders, and her hands were clenched as if holding something larger than she could contain. Michael hesitated before opening the door, but he did. Not because he expected something new, but because he wanted closure, or at least understanding. Emily entered slowly, as if each step on the familiar floor weighed a ton. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but now there was something different in the air. She didn't smile, didn't seek eye contact, just sat on the sofa as if her bones no longer supported her. He stood, arms crossed, waiting. And then she said she needed to speak. But this time not to apologize. Not to beg. She said she needed to tell him the truth, all of it, and that only then would she accept the definitive silence he offered her. Michael nodded and remained standing, as if her firmness were the only thing protecting him from what was yet to come. Emily began slowly, her voice low and unhurried. She said she'd been deeply mistaken, more than he could have imagined. That there was a moment when she truly believed she was simply seeking freedom, that her intention was never to hurt, only to understand herself. But she soon realized the choices she'd made weren't hers alone. That they had consequences she couldn't even manage. Michael remained silent, watching her every gesture, every measured word. She took a deep breath before continuing, and it was at that moment that the tension in the air became almost unbearable. When she finally looked up, there was a fear there he'd never seen before. Emily said it all started months before the party, during a project that brought her closer to someone on the creative team. An older, experienced, charismatic, married man. At first, it was just lunches and long conversations about work, texting after hours, and inside jokes. Until then, she convinced herself it was all professional. But the boundaries began to blur. The flirting grew like a weed, silent and sneaky. One night, after a tiring meeting, he walked her to her car. The touch on her shoulder lingered longer than necessary. And it was in that tiny detail that everything began to fall apart. She didn't back down. And from that moment on, she began to lose herself. Michael listened without moving a muscle. His heart pounded, but his face remained impassive. Emily continued, her voice now cracking. She said that, in the following days, they exchanged intimate messages, confidences, photos. He said things she hadn't heard in a long time, making her feel special, desired, alive. It was a game of vanity. And she gave in. She gave in out of need, pride, pure vanity. The first kiss happened in the parking lot, inside his car. Then came hotel dates, excuses to leave work early, lies. So many lies. Emily said she thought she could control it, that it was just a phase, that it would end before it got out of hand. But she did. And she fell. Completely. Michael finally sat down, but still didn't speak. He felt as if he were watching his own funeral, hearing details of what had killed him. His chest burned, his throat dry. Emily paused for a moment, as if needing to catch her breath for the final blow. And it was then that, in a barely audible whisper, she said that he, her lover, knew everything. He knew she was married. He knew she had no intention of leaving her husband. But even so, he continued. And she believed there was a connection there, something possible. Until, a few days after the party, she sought him out. She wanted to talk, to clear things up, to ask for a break. And it was at that moment that he laughed. A dry, disdainful, cruel laugh. He said he'd never wanted anything serious. That she was just an after-hours distraction. That married women were easier because they came with ready-made excuses. That there had never been affection. Only interest. Only the pleasure of conquest. She stared at him, still trying to understand. She asked if it had all been a lie. He simply shrugged and said her husband deserved better. That he'd never understood what she saw in such a ordinary man. And there, in that moment, she realized she hadn't just betrayed him. She'd been used. Ridiculed. Discarded. And that she'd thrown away true love for a man who hadn't even pretended to care. Michael looked at her with a mixture of disgust, pity, and disbelief. But she wasn't finished yet. There was more. Then came the final blow. Emily revealed that her lover didn't just know about the marriage. He knew Michael. Not intimately, but by sight. They had been together at company events, open meetings. And more than that, her lover knew exactly who he was. And yet, he chose to continue. Michael sat back in his chair, his body rigid. He could feel the veins pulsing in his neck. But what came next was even crueler. Emily said she met her lover days after the divorce, trying to understand the reason for his contempt. And in that meeting, he revealed that he had done it all on purpose. That he was jealous of Michael. That he had always seen him as untouchable, the kind of man who was stable, respected, and admired. And so, he decided to destroy him. He wanted to prove that no one was invincible. That even the strongest marriage could be broken. That even the most devoted woman could cheat. That no one was as righteous as they seemed. That there were no unshakable men. He said it all coldly, like someone describing a game of chess. Emily, stunned, realized she had been just a piece. A pedestrian used to hurt someone who had never hurt her. Michael remained motionless, his face pale. Silence was the only sound for a few seconds. Emily was crying, but now there was no comfort. There were no more excuses. What she had destroyed wasn't just a marriage. It was Michael's self-image. It was the security he held in his own identity. Knowing that someone had targeted him, that the woman he loved had become the instrument of that revenge, was something he could never erase. And even though she wasn't directly to blame, she allowed it. She got involved. She handed over the keys to the castle. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and sat in silence for a while. The sun was setting outside, tinting the sky orange, but inside, all was darkness. Finally, he turned to her, his eyes watery but free of tears. He simply said that he understood now. That everything made sense. And that there was nothing more to say. That forgiveness might one day come. But her presence would not. That she was no longer welcome in his life, nor in his memories. That what he felt now was not hatred, but emptiness. And that the worst kind of pain was to look at someone you had loved deeply and feel nothing anymore. Emily tried to approach, but he took a step back. He asked her to leave. And this time, she obeyed. She left silently, her shoulders hunched, as if carrying the weight of having destroyed not only a story, but herself. Michael remained there, staring at the closed door, feeling the silence fill him completely. There were no more questions. Only the certainty that love, when betrayed, turns to ruins. And some ruins can never be rebuilt. But what he didn't yet know, is that life sometimes offers new beginnings where you least expect them. And even in the ashes of what was lost, something new can still blossom. Even if he wasn't yet ready to see it. Night fell with unbearable slowness that Sunday. After Emily left, the apartment door remained ajar for minutes, as if the silence needed to escape with her. Michael remained motionless, his eyes fixed on nothing, unsure whether he felt relief, disbelief, or an exhaustion so profound it couldn't be put into words. He closed the door carefully, unhurriedly, as if that gesture marked the end not just of a chapter, but of an entire existence that no longer made sense. No tears came. No anger. No despair. Just a strange stillness, as if everything inside him was suspended. He went to his bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and studied his reflection in the closet mirror. He recognized the face, but he didn't fully recognize himself. Something had been ripped from him that night. Something that might never return. The next morning, the sun invaded the apartment without asking permission, illuminating a space that now seemed larger, emptier, more hollow. Michael made coffee as usual, but didn't taste it. He grabbed his keys and went for a walk aimlessly. He needed to breathe, to escape the place where everything seemed frozen. He walked through unfamiliar streets, crossed squares, observed families, children, couples. And he felt like a spectator in a life that had once been his and now seemed to belong to others. At some point, he stopped at a small cafe tucked away on a corner. He sat in the back, ordered just a cup of tea, and stood there, staring out the window, trying to make sense of what had become. It was then that he received the first message from an unknown number. It contained no words, just a photo, he and Emily smiling, holding hands, at a long-ago dinner. An intimate image he couldn't remember sharing with anyone but her. He ignored it. But in the following days, other messages arrived. Snippets of old conversations, screenshots, images taken out of context. Michael began to realize that his lover hadn't just been playing with his wife, he was playing with him too. This wasn't just marital betrayal, it was a game of profound manipulation, an attempt to destroy his sanity, his pride, his identity. A kind of silent sadism that manifested itself between the lines, in indirect provocations, in distorted memories that now returned like ghosts. Michael tried to block the number, but another one always popped up. He tried to ignore it, but the anger that had previously seemed to have dissolved began to reconfigure itself within. It was no longer just hurt over the betrayal. It was humiliation. It was the feeling of being hunted, used as a pawn in a petty scheme. And worst of all, he didn't know how far it would go. In one of the messages, the man wrote, "You can forgive your wife, but what about yourself? Can you?" This hit Michael like a punch. The pain was no longer for her. It was for himself. For the foolish image they had painted of him. For the vulnerability he had offered, which had been trampled upon. On impulse, he went to the company where Emily worked. Not angry, but searching for answers. He didn't want to see her, but he needed to understand if anyone else knew, if they had witnessed his downfall without him knowing. In the lobby, he ran into a former colleague of hers, who recognized him. The conversation was brief, but enough to confirm what he already feared. Many knew. Some merely suspected. Others commented. The social silence around him was no longer just an impression. He had been exposed, even if only in whispers, even if only in glances. That night, when Michael arrived home, he found an envelope under his door. No return address. Inside, just a handwritten letter in Emily's handwriting. The content was direct, almost emotionless. She said she was leaving town for a while. That she couldn't stand the stares, the judgments, or her own shame anymore. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply thanked him for being everything she never knew how to appreciate. She ended by saying that if he ever loved again, he hoped it would be with someone who would never make him doubt her. There were no tears on the paper, but Michael felt her sadness woven into the words. A sadness that no longer evoked compassion. Only distance. Without knowing exactly why, he decided to change his scenery. He requested a vacation, closed his apartment, and booked a cabin in the mountains. He needed fresh air, nature, and pain-free silence. During the first few days, he barely went out. He read, walked a little, and wrote random sentences in a notebook. He wasn't sure if he wanted to start a book, vent, or simply record what was left of himself. And it was on one of those cold days, while stopping at a local coffee shop, that he found a woman sitting alone, reading the same book he carried in his backpack. A trivial detail, but one that made him smile for the first time in weeks. Her name was Lauren. She had a calm gaze, a low voice, and spoke as if meditating before choosing each word. The conversation began shyly, and continued the next day, and the next. There was no seduction, no rush. Just two strangers sharing absences. She had recently lost her father and was seeking peace away from the city. Michael didn't tell her his story right away, but he spoke enough for her to sense there was something unresolved there. And over time, he allowed himself to tell her. Not as a victim, but as someone who had survived. And as she listened, Lauren offered no consolation or advice. She simply listened. And that, surprisingly, was more healing than any hug. What was born there wasn't passion, nor unbridled desire. It was presence. It was respect. Lauren looked at him with the gentleness of someone who didn't want to fill a space, but simply to be company while he rebuilt his own path. Michael began to laugh again, to sleep better, to walk for hours without thinking about the past. He didn't fall in love immediately, but something inside him began to change. For the first time in a long time, he felt that what had happened with Emily was no longer the center of his life. It was just part of a larger story, a story that was now taking on new pages. A few weeks later, when he returned home, he found new messages from Emily. They weren't invasive, nor desperate. Just a few lines saying she hoped he was okay. Michael replied with a simple, "I am," and realized there was no pain in writing. That wound, once open and throbbing, was now just a scar. He had bled dry. And survived. In the months that followed, he continued to see Lauren. Lightly, without unrealistic expectations. He discovered in her something he hadn't known he needed, peace. It wasn't a replacement. It was a new story, without comparisons. A story that began slowly, as all things that matter should. Emily never returned to town. They say she moved out of state, started over somewhere else, trying to rebuild something from the ashes. They never spoke directly again, only scattered news, distant rumors. Michael never wanted revenge. What he wanted, in the end, was to simply look at himself in the mirror again without guilt. And he achieved it. Because, despite everything, he understood that it wasn't he who failed. It wasn't he who destroyed. It was he who trusted, who invested, who surrendered. And if that was used against him, there was no shame in loving. The shame, however, belonged to the one who threw away what was most precious to him. And when he and Lauren, some time later, sat side by side on a park bench, hands intertwined and heart serene, Michael finally understood that true love isn't blinding, nor consuming, but enduring, even after the pain. Even after the end. Even when everything seemed irreversible. And it was there, in that peaceful moment, that his story truly began. The morning breeze no longer bit as sharply as before, and the days had become less burdensome, as if something inside him, long twisted, had finally found space to settle. Michael didn't seek explanations, nor answers, because at some point he had understood that certain pains aren't resolved with logic, but with time. It was strange how, after so much chaos, life could resume an almost silent, almost gentle rhythm. His steps no longer carried guilt, his chest no longer carried anger, and his thoughts no longer revolved in vicious circles around what could have been. It was as if he were crossing a field of ruins, his eyes fixed on the horizon, no longer on the wreckage behind him. But there was something that still disturbed him, a presence that could not be erased with a simple gesture or decision, the living memory of the love that once was, and the cruel dilemma of how to move on without becoming someone too bitter to feel again. Lauren had entered his life like a light, respectful breeze, unhurried to fill space. She didn't try to erase the past, didn't fight over memories, and this made Michael feel, for the first time, free to feel whatever he wanted without guilt. Being with her brought peace, but it also ignited something delicate and dangerous, the realization that rebuilding meant, above all, allowing himself to be vulnerable again. And that wasn't simple. As much affection, care, and admiration as there was also fear. Fear of giving himself over and, once again, being betrayed. Fear of loving someone who might not love him back with the same depth. Fear of becoming a suspicious, dry man, too cautious to take the plunge. With each new encounter with Lauren, he felt more alive, but also more divided. Sometimes he would smile in the middle of a conversation and, upon realizing his own happiness, he would be overcome by a feeling of guilt, as if he were betraying his own pain, as if he were allowing himself too much. It was a silent but constant conflict. An internal battle between the desire to start over and the weight of poorly healed scars. Lauren sensed it. She saw in his eyes the hesitation he tried to hide, and so she never demanded, never pressured. She gave space, but never withdrew. And this, little by little, made Michael wonder if, perhaps, true love wasn't the kind that demands, but the kind that understands the other's time even when everything inside begs for haste. One gray afternoon, sitting with Lauren by a lake, Michael shared details he'd never spoken before, not even in his thoughts. He spoke of the feeling of being diminished, the shame that came with exposure, the feeling of being used and ridiculed, the profound emptiness he felt upon discovering he'd been the target of premeditated revenge. Lauren listened silently, without interrupting, without reacting with pity. When he finished, she simply said she admired his courage to continue feeling. Many, after something like that, would shut themselves off forever. But not him. He was still able to look at the world through the eyes of someone who longs to love. And that, in itself, was immense. Her words touched him more than he expected. Not because they offered comfort, but because they validated his pain without diminishing it. Michael returned home that night feeling lighter, but with a clear head. For the first time in a long time, he began to seriously consider leaving the past in the past. Not forgetting it, because that would be impossible, but putting it where it belongs. And that required something he'd been putting off, facing Emily one last time, with the maturity time had given him and the clarity of someone who no longer carried anger as a shield. She arranged to meet at a discreet coffee shop, without pretense. It wasn't a request for reconciliation. It wasn't a settling of scores. It was simply the final chapter of a book that needed to be closed with dignity. When she arrived, she looked different. Not only in her face, her more tired features, her eyes that no longer held the same sparkle, but also in her posture. She sat down carefully, never avoiding his gaze. She ordered just a black coffee. And then she began to talk. She didn't apologize. She had done that before, many times. But she spoke of what happened afterward. Of the long nights, the therapy, the shame that made her avoid public places. She said that for a long time she believed his silence was punishment, but now she understood it was merely protection. She said she tried to get back together, but realized she carried within herself an insecurity that had arisen the moment she was rejected by her lover and, at the same time, lost the only man who truly loved her. And then she said something Michael hadn't expected to hear. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just want you to know that I understand. Not what I lost. I knew that the moment you didn't look at me the same way you used to. But I understood what you felt. And if I were in your place, I might not have been able to handle it. You were stronger than me." Michael listened, absorbed, and for the first time, responded not with silence, but with full words. He said he had spent too much time trying to understand where he had gone wrong, when the truth was simple, he had not. Trusting, loving, and surrendering himself was not a mistake. The mistake was made by those who used it as an advantage. And now, after all this, all he felt was gratitude for what he had learned. He learned that love without respect is not love. That forgiveness does not mean return. And that peace does not come from the absence of pain, but from the choice to move forward despite it. The conversation ended with a handshake. There was no resentment there. Just two strangers who had once been everything to each other and now recognized only the road they traveled. Michael left that coffee shop with his heart silent. Not empty, but balanced. He had done what needed to be done. And now, finally, he could leave behind the shadow of an unresolved story. In the days that followed, he began to look at Lauren differently. Not with the anxiety of someone who needs to love to forget, but with the serenity of someone ready to build something real, without haste, without fear. And it was during a simple dinner, on one of those days when everything seems ordinary, that he looked at her and said, firmly and lightly, "I'm here. Now, completely." Lauren didn't cry, didn't say anything grand. She just smiled and held his hand tightly. That was enough. But even with everything seemingly in order, there was still something Michael needed to face. Something no one could do for him. The decision to trust again. Not in Lauren, but in his own ability to love without the fear of betrayal. To trust that the past didn't define the future. That his story wasn't about being betrayed, but about surviving. And, more than that, about finding dignity amidst ruin. That night, as he lay beside Lauren, he felt the weight of the choices that had brought him here. Not as a burden, but as baggage. And for the first time, he understood that love doesn't have to be perfect to be true. That what matters isn't never falling, but knowing how to rise with more truth, more firmness, more courage. And what came next, would be unlike anything else. Because now, he was no longer the same man. And perhaps, that was the greatest victory of all. The following months unfolded with an unexpectedly gentle rhythm, as if, after so much turmoil, life were offering a kind of silent respite. Michael and Lauren no longer experienced spaced encounters, but a shared routine that grew in small, profound details, waking up together on Sundays, making coffee side by side, laughing at each other's quirks. And yet, there was something Michael hadn't yet confronted, the ambiguous feeling that crept in whenever he looked to the future. The past no longer held him back, that was certain. But the future, however promising, still frightened him. Not because of doubt about Lauren, but because of uncertainty about himself. Love, after what he'd experienced, was like walking on glass, possible, but requiring care with every step. One day, on a sultry late afternoon, Lauren invited him for a hike to a hidden viewpoint among the park's trails. It was a place she said she'd discovered by chance weeks before, and she wanted to share it with him. They climbed together, chatting lightly and pausing for breath. By the time they reached the top, the sun was already setting behind the hills, casting the sky a deep orange that tinged everything with an aura of rebirth. Lauren sat on the main rock, crossed her legs, and watched him with a calm smile. Michael sat beside her, silent. For long minutes, they said nothing. They just listened to the wind rustling the leaves, the birds announcing the end of the day, and each other's breathing, there, constant and present. It was Lauren who broke the silence, directly but gently. She said she'd been feeling that, even though he was present in body and gesture, there were parts of her that were still hidden. She didn't want to pressure him, but rather wanted to understand what was preventing him from fully immersing himself in the story they were slowly building together. Michael looked off into the distance, searching for words that wouldn't betray him. He took a deep breath and said, his voice firm but shaky, that it wasn't about not trusting her, nor about still being stuck in the past. It was about fear of himself. About not knowing if he could handle new pain if it came. He said he'd learned to recognize the signs, but that this made him too skeptical, too vigilant, and that, even though he wanted to surrender, part of him still protected himself like someone who fears fire even after the flame has died out. Lauren didn't respond immediately. She simply reached out and held his hand tightly. After a few seconds, she told him she understood. That she, too, had lost things that seemed eternal. That her love wasn't a request for haste, but a promise of constancy. That she didn't need him to be perfect, but rather honest. And that if he ever decided to take a step forward, she would be there, not to hold his hand, but to walk alongside him, at the same pace. Michael didn't cry. But inside him, something unraveled and reassembled. It was as if her words were exactly what he hadn't known he needed to hear. That night, lying in bed next to Lauren, Michael woke in the middle of the night with the feeling that something had changed. He looked at the ceiling, then at her peaceful profile sleeping beside him, and felt an almost unconscious urge to get up. He walked to the porch, sat on the cool wooden floor, and stayed there for long minutes, breathing. He thought about everything he'd experienced, but for the first time without weight. Just as part of the journey. And then, almost as if by instinct, he picked up his phone and wrote a message to Emily. Nothing complex. Just one sentence, I truly hope you're at peace. He didn't expect a reply. Nor did he want one. But he felt he needed to write it, not for her, but for himself. It was a way to definitively close the chapter that, for so long, he'd insisted on keeping half open. The next morning, he found Lauren in the kitchen, making coffee. She looked at him and smiled, as she did every day. But he came closer, hugged her from behind, and said with new firmness, I'm ready. She turned, surprised, but said nothing. She just rested her forehead against his, and they stayed there for a while, silent, their hearts saying everything words couldn't. The relationship between the two began to blossom more clearly. They began making real plans, a trip at the end of the year, perhaps renting a new apartment, perhaps even considering something longer-term, more stable. But, as life likes to test convictions, it was precisely in this moment of harmony that the unexpected knocked on the door again. It was a rainy Friday when Michael received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He answered without thinking, and on the other end was the voice of an unfamiliar woman. She introduced herself as Amanda, claiming to be the wife of the man Emily had been involved with. At first, Michael considered hanging up. It seemed like an unnecessary return to the past, something he'd already buried. But the woman's voice was calm, almost formal. She said she didn't want to cause trouble, she just needed to talk to him about something that involved them both. Against his better judgment, he arranged to meet at a cafe downtown, somewhere busy enough for everything to seem casual. When he arrived, Amanda was already waiting for him. She was younger than he'd imagined, with a tired expression and eyes that looked like they'd cried more than they should have. They sat across from each other, and she was direct. She told him she'd discovered, too late, her husband's affair with Emily. She said she tried to keep the marriage together even after that, but that in recent months, his personality had become unstable and obsessive. Their marriage had fallen apart, and she now lived in a kind of emotional limbo. Amanda explained that after the whole thing, her husband began looking for ways to find Michael again. She said he mentioned unfinished business, spoke with contempt, as if he regretted nothing. And then, in a lower voice, she said that one night, he detailed how he'd planned it all. How he'd approached Emily only for the pleasure of destruction. How he'd even considered approaching Michael directly, just to gauge the effects of his own cruelty. Michael listened to everything with controlled coolness, but inside he felt a chill forming again. Amanda pulled out an envelope and handed it to him. She said it contained copies of exchanged messages, evidence, even an audio recording in which he confessed that it was all just a psychological game with a man he could never stand. Michael took the envelope but didn't open it. He simply thanked her. Amanda said goodbye, emotionless. Before leaving, she said that, even though she hadn't known him, she was sorry for what he'd been through. That no one deserved to be treated like a broken trophy by someone too sick to acknowledge their own emptiness. That night, Michael told Lauren everything. For the first time, he felt he could share without fear. He showed the evidence, explained the details, and instead of judgment, he received only acceptance. She said maybe it was time to come clean. To free himself once and for all. Not for revenge, but so that others wouldn't go through the same thing. Michael considered the possibility. For the first time, he considered telling his story publicly, voicing his pain not as a lament, but as a sign that there is life after destruction. But before that, he needed to do something even more difficult, forgive himself. And, unexpectedly, it was Lauren who prompted him to do it. Days later, she took him to a secluded beach, where they wrote together on sheets of paper everything that still held them back, memories, guilt, unanswered questions. They tied the sheets together, placed them in a glass jar, and threw it into the sea. Not as a mystical ritual, but as a symbolic gesture that sometimes we need to let the waters wash away what is no longer part of who we are. Back in the car, Michael held Lauren's hand tightly. He said that, finally, he felt something inside him had healed. That, despite all the losses, he was ready to begin again, not as someone starting over from scratch, but as someone who carries the scars within him like medals of victory. Lauren, with a smile that said more than any words, simply replied that he had never been anything other than himself, even in the moments he doubted it. And in that moment, as the road stretched out before him, Michael knew the end hadn't yet arrived. Because the true end isn't when the pain subsides, but when we can look at it without it breaking us inside. And this road, though difficult, still held one last unexpected curve. A curve that would, once again, change everything. The weeks passed with a kind of silence that no longer bothered, but brought a strange serenity, as if each part of the pain had finally found its place within him, not to disappear, but to no longer bother. Michael began to view his own story with the eyes of someone who has survived a shipwreck, still scarred, still with memories, but with a heart filled with profound self-respect. The relationship with Lauren matured naturally, without major milestones, without grandiose announcements, only with everyday gestures that reaffirmed what love truly was, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that endures even when the world falls apart. Trust was rebuilt stone by stone, and he began to see her not just as a companion, but as an extension of the balance he had so long sought within himself. It wasn't a redemption of the past. It was a reconstruction of the future. One night, after a simple dinner, Lauren suggested something unexpected. She said she and a friend were organizing a small, private gathering about stories of emotional overcoming, for people who had experienced abusive relationships, infidelity, and emotional devastation that left invisible scars. It was a low-key affair, without media coverage, without exposure. But she thought Michael should tell his story. Not as a way to relive the pain, but as an act of generosity to those still buried in it. Michael hesitated. He wasn't the type to open up easily to strangers. But that night, he kept thinking about it. About the messages he'd received, the letters he'd never answered, the silence he'd maintained for so long for fear of appearing weak. And he realized that perhaps sharing his pain, now transformed into a lesson, would be another step on his path to healing. The following Saturday, he sat in a cozy room, surrounded by strangers who also carried stories of loss, of breakups, of disappointments impossible to name. When it was his turn to speak, he began slowly. No drama, no unnecessary details. But when he finished, there was a heavy silence in the air, the kind of silence that arises when someone says something so true that no one can ignore it. Leaving there, he felt lighter. As if, by sharing, he had lifted a weight he hadn't even known he still carried. And with that, something inside him closed. Not with pain, but with dignity. But the story still had its ending. An ending that isn't written with reunions or theatrical gestures, but with the natural justice of life. A few months after that encounter, Lauren received a call. It was Amanda, the woman who had once sought out Michael to tell him about the true nature of the man who had been involved with Emily. She was calling to warn him that the man was being formally investigated for psychological and moral harassment within the company. Several women, over the years, finally decided to report it. Cases filed, silenced conversations, deleted emails, everything began to surface. He had built a sick web of emotional manipulation over the years. Emily wasn't the only one. Nor the first. Nor the last. When the news reached Michael, he felt no pleasure. He wasn't thrilled. He simply remained silent for a few minutes and then declared that it was all no longer his. But something about that outcome, however belated, brought a sense that the truth, even when delayed, always finds its way. That man's downfall didn't come at the hands of Michael or Emily. It came through the choices he made, the trails he left, the lives he destroyed with the cynical pleasure of someone who believes he'll never be caught. And when he finally fell alone. Without scandal, without spectacle. He simply disappeared from the scene he once dominated with arrogance. Emily, for her part, had rebuilt her life in another state. Working as a freelancer, away from the spotlight. She didn't remarry. She didn't get involved in anything lasting. The few reports that arrived were vague, but one said she had started giving lectures on ethics in relationships, on the emotional impact of thoughtless choices. It seemed ironic, but perhaps it was her way of redeeming herself, not from the world, but from herself. Michael listened neutrally. He didn't want to know the details. He didn't wish her harm. But deep down, he felt that the loss of everything she once had was her punishment. There was no need for revenge. Life itself had already put everything back in place. The love she threw away, the man she destroyed, the reputation she lost, these were now memories she would have to carry without an audience, without applause. Months later, Lauren and Michael traveled to a secluded village to celebrate 2 years since they met. It was there, under the stars, around a small campfire, that he proposed. Not with rehearsed phrases or soap opera declarations, but with a simplicity that only those who have endured darkness can appreciate. He said he wanted to grow old with someone who knew the value of truth. Who understood that fidelity isn't a prison, but respect. That love isn't possession, but presence. And that if she wanted to stay by his side, he wouldn't promise perfection, but honesty. Lauren said yes. She didn't cry, she didn't get overly emotional. She simply held his hand firmly and told him she was ready to be the home he'd always sought. On the way back, Michael passed an antique store and saw a young, loving couple arguing over a sofa. He laughed inwardly. He remembered himself and Emily back then, when everything was simple, and they didn't yet know how costly wrong decisions could be. But he didn't miss them. He felt respect. Because he knew they were genuine. That they gave their all. And that if they were destroyed, it wasn't through weakness, but through overcommitment. Today, his story is different. Made of ordinary days, of quiet laughter, of sincere glances. He still remembers. He still knows the past existed. But now, when he remembers, he doesn't bleed. Because he understands that true love isn't what rescues us from pain, but what walks with us after it's past. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar? We want to hear your opinion. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and don't miss any of our next stories. And remember, cheating doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, self-esteem, family bonds, entire histories. Sometimes, a moment of selfishness is enough to destroy years of sincere dedication. Here, we don't romanticize infidelity. we honestly show what it leaves behind. Until the next story.